actual kills. Okay, so let's see how we got to the end.
Hands down, keep your heads down. Up to the front, reload!
1865. With endless skirmishing at Petersburg, Sherman marches through the Carolinas, meeting minimal resistance. Confederates lash out at Bentonville, but gain nothing. His strength waning, General Joe Johnston writes Lee saying, "I can do no more than annoy Sherman." With Sherman closing on Petersburg, Lee launches half his army upon Grant at Fort Stedman. But the Confederates cannot break out. Grant counterattacks all along the line, making key gains. The Confederate Congress desperately authorizes the enlistment of black soldiers, but no such unit sees combat. Union victories at White Oak Road and Five Forks set the stage for the breakthrough of Confederate lines. Petersburg and Richmond are evacuated as Lee moves westward. Savage combat at Sailor's Creek further degrades Lee's forces. Some of Lee's subordinates urge him to disperse the army and continue the war with guerrilla tactics. Lee firmly declines. Finally, on April 9th, Grant catches Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Out of food, surrounded, and appallingly outnumbered, Lee surrenders. Johnston is brought to the same conclusion later that month, surrendering to Sherman at Bennett's Place. As the news spreads, Confederate units across the country lay down their arms. Amidst these surrenders, tragedy strikes. President Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Southern sympathizer. North and South are both deprived of Lincoln's leadership in the painful reconstruction to come. Jefferson Davis flees southward but is captured in Georgia. 4 years, 10,000 engagements. At last, the carnage is over. 620,000 dead, 2% of the American population at that time. Today, 2% would equal more than 6.5 million Americans gone. In the wake of victory, 200,000 Union soldiers marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in the Grand Review. Grant and Lee both urge a peaceful return to civilian life. As Confederate states re-enter the Union, the nation ratifies the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery and granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. But it will take much longer for these new rights to be enforced by law. During and after the turbulent Reconstruction period, Civil War veterans form groups, write books, and found newspapers. Cemeteries are established for soldiers on both sides. Battlefield land is preserved, and veterans erect monuments on these battlefields to memorialize their deeds.
Okay, that was abrupt. But there you go. So, Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. Did you catch why Lee surrendered? What was captured that he would not be able to survive from?
He had no food.
He had no food. Okay. So if you capture the supplies, then you can win the war. Okay. Ruth, can you close your Chromebook, please? Thank you. All right. So I have a book, The Greatest Stories, 100 Tales from History to Astonish, Bewilder, and Stupefy, Never Told. So this is about the surrender. It's actually called The Beginning and the End. It said, in July of 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War was fought in Manassas, Virginia. The Battle of Bull Run was a confused and bloody clash that shocked the nation with its carnage. Wilmer McLean owned a plantation on the edge of the battlefield. It was so close to the fighting that a shell pierced the kitchen wall. That was too close for a call as far as McLean was concerned. He moved his family to a remote Virginia town, quote, where the sound of battle would never reach them, end quote. But in the end, the war caught up to them. 4 years later, Robert E. Lee led the weary remnants of his Confederate army into that very town, called Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9th, 1865, he decided his men could fight no more and sought a meeting with General Grant to negotiate terms of surrender. One of Lee's aides selected a place for the two men to meet. It was just by quirk of fate that the place he picked was the front room of Wilmer McLean's new home. So it started at his house, and then it ended at his house, but in two different locations. I thought that was really interesting. So Appomattox Courthouse is a town. I'm assuming there's a courthouse there. But there's a short little video that I want you to see about the actual surrender and the terms of surrender. I really want you to hear what Grant offered Lee. I think that's important.
It was about 1 o'clock on Palm Sunday afternoon, April the 9th, 1865, that General Lee, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall of his own staff and Colonel Orville Babcock of General Grant's staff, these three men arrived in the parlor of the home. General Lee takes a seat at the white marble top to my right, and he waits. The 58-year-old Lee is exhausted. He's been in the saddle every day since the Army left Petersburg on April the 2nd. No evidence of any decent sleep. And when he arrives at the parlor, he may have been a little frustrated that the meeting was not going to begin with General Grant that would result in the surrender of his army, Army of Northern Virginia. Frustrated because Lee was openly concerned that unnecessary fighting could erupt along the lines now that he had made the decision to surrender. But at 1:30, General Grant does arrive with quite an entourage. His staff, in addition with General Ord and General Sheridan, but it's Grant who comes into the room initially. He asks Lee if he remembers that they had met during the Mexican War. It's not clear that Lee remembers that meeting, but the conversation went off in a direction not about the terms of surrender. No surprise, it was Lee who suggested that perhaps General Grant should write the terms down, and General Grant removed himself to a separate table, asked for a field notebook, and began to write a letter to General Lee in pencil, a draft. A letter, not a treaty. American wars tend to end in treaties, but its largest war can't. That would be diplomatic recognition. Instead, Grant had to find another way to convey these generous terms. Even General Lee considered the terms generous. Grant would require Confederate soldiers to lay down their military equipment, but once they had done so, they would be allowed to be paroled to go directly home from Appomattox. The officers would be allowed to retain sidearms, pistols, and swords. Even former Confederates that claimed to own their own animals, mules, horses, would be allowed to keep those too. Grant was implementing what Lincoln wanted him to. Lincoln met with Grant before this campaign and Sherman and wanted the Confederates to be let up easy, get them back to their farms and their shops. And Grant did that by paroling the Confederates here at Appomattox. Lee would have Charles Marshall write a response letter to Grant's letter, agreeing to the terms. The letters were exchanged, and by 3 o'clock, the meeting had ended. Lee left first, and once mounted Traveler in the front yard and left to return to his army, but before he left the yard, exchanged a tipping of the hat with General Grant. Lee returned back to his army, where about 30,000 men awaited to hear if the rumor was true. Grant left a little later, and once he did, behind, here in the parlor, were more than a dozen federal officers, Grant's staff, and others. They found themselves in a room full of some pretty nice souvenirs, evidence that this meeting was surreal even for them. Lee and Grant had just met face to face. The tables that Lee and Grant had used, the chairs they had used, the candlesticks on Lee's table, even the doll on the mantle that belonged to 7-year-old Lula McLean were all taken as souvenirs, some paid for, some not. Today, in the parlor, the horsehair sofa inside, also the 2 vases on the mantle behind me are original. The candlesticks from Lee's table and Lula's doll are in the museum, in the visitor center here at the park.
All right, so what were the terms of surrender?
The soldiers have to put down their weapons.
Mm-hmm. But then what could they do?
Go home.
They can go home. And what were the officers allowed to do?
Keep their guns in their swords.
So why would Lincoln, who's trying to squash this civil uprising, so to speak, allow that? Because that's what he's telling Grant that you need to get across. And that's what I want you to do. Why would Lincoln do that? Especially if the nickname of Grant is, do you remember what it was? It's the Butcher. And he used every tactic to wipe out his enemy to make them to come to surrender. So why is he allowing it to go off so easy? What do you think? What's the psychological reason for that?
Maybe if like the union like lets them off and doesn't just like arrest all of them, maybe they might realize that maybe they were the Confederate side were the bad guys, and that maybe they should try to change to fit in with the Union because they let them off easy and they let them go home back to their families.
Yeah, that could be. I think that's a really good reasoning behind that. For sure. Because who are they fighting? Who's the Union fighting?
The South?
Yeah, the South. Is it foreign nationals? No, they're fighting their own citizens. So I think Lincoln really wanted to start the process of reintegrating them back into becoming those citizens, or not becoming those citizens, but being unified again, for sure. For sure. So that was on April 9th, 1865. On April 14th, what happened? Ruth? Yes?
When he got assassinated?
Lincoln was assassinated, yeah. And a lot of people know the guy's name. You remember the guy's name? Yeah, John Wilkes Booth. So here's how that kind of went about. Set on noon on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865. So how many days after the surrender? 5. General Robert Anderson raised the U.S. flag over Fort Sumter. It was the same flag that he had surrendered 4 years before. That evening, a few minutes after 10 o'clock, John Wilkes Booth, a young actor and Confederate sympathizer who had spied for Richmond and been part of a plot to kidnap Lincoln, entered the presidential box at Ford's Theater in Washington and shot the president in the back of the head. Booth then leaped to the stage, but he caught a spur in a flag draped in front of the box, and he fell and broke his leg. As he fled the theater, he is said to have cried out, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of the state of Virginia. At the same time, a Booth accomplice named Lewis Payne brutally attacked Senator or Secretary of State William Seward at his home with a knife. Seward survived because Payne's knife was deflected by a metal collar that he wore from a severe accident. Seward slowly recovered from his wounds and continued to serve as Secretary of State under Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. Lincoln was carried unconscious to a neighboring house, and he was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. A few minutes later, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stepped outside and announced to the assembled crowd, "He belongs to the ages." Following the shooting, Booth fled to Maryland on horseback, and a friend then helped him escape to Virginia. On April 26, 2 weeks after he had shot Lincoln, the Army and Secret Service tracked down Booth and trapped him in a barn near Port Royal, Virginia. And when Booth refused to surrender, his pursuers set the barn on fire. And Booth was found dead, apparently of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So Lincoln's assassination was a part of a larger plot to murder other government officials, including Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and General Grant. And only Lincoln was killed. So following the assassination, the Secretary of War ordered War Department agents to apprehend the conspirators. So that included, apart from Booth, an ex-Confederate soldier, a carriage maker, and a druggist clerk. 8 individuals were arrested. A military commission found all of them guilty. 4 were hanged, and of the remaining 4, 1 died in prison and the others were pardoned. So there's that. So now the Confederates have assassinated the President of the United States. What do you think the reaction of America was? This is after he helped win the war.
Shock.
Shock for sure. Absolutely. What's your next gut reaction?
Anger.
Anger? And then what do you want?
Revenge.
Revenge. And did they do that?
No.
They didn't. Okay. Which is very surprising, actually. Because when 9/11 happened, we took revenge very quickly. Right? So it's interesting that we did not do the same to our fellow citizens. Okay. So we talked about this before on Monday, that and we looked at a battle that resulted in the freeing of particular slaves. Do you remember what Lincoln passed to help free the slaves? Mm-hmm. So the Emancipation Proclamation, and emancipation means to free. Now, before Lincoln's assassination, he was working on something else that he wanted Congress to pass, and that eventually will be the 13th Amendment. Now, why do we need the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery if we already have the Emancipation Proclamation?
Because an amendment can be like enforced by law, and a proclamation is just like.
I said it, so do it kind of thing, maybe. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's logical reasoning. So we're going to take a look at those 2 documents and really discover why that occurred, and like why we need the 13th Amendment rather than just the Emancipation Proclamation, because that helps transition us from the end of the war into Reconstruction, and how do you even recover from such a traumatic event. So the 13th Amendment was put to Congress and debated right before he was assassinated, and shortly thereafter, was it in May? Maybe, I think it says actually. Just look at my source. No, it just says 1865. But it was after his assassination that Congress passed the 13th Amendment. Okay? So we're going to take a look at the documents. Because we're looking at documents, we probably need either a pencil or a highlighter. And let me transition. I'll turn the lights on, and I see some permission slips, and I will pick those up. Sure, lavender, we're doing stuff. Oh, another one of those stories in that book that I read from mentions that Booth had a brother who saved Abraham Lincoln's son the year before. It's kind of interesting. Now, so we've got this Emancipation Proclamation, which has a lot of words. And then if you flip it to the second page and you see the 13th Amendment, it's very short. Which I think is very good, actually. So it's very clear what this particular amendment is all about. All right. So, anybody want to be Abraham Lincoln? He's going to proclaim this. Ruth? You want to read it? You have to put your pencil down. You don't have to. I'm just saying. Go for it. And I may stop you at several paragraphs just so we can go over and see what it's actually meaning. Okay? Proclamation.
Proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1863, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States, containing among other things the following: that on the first day of January, the first year of Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves of any state or designated as of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the next, shall be thenceforward and forever free, in the exclusive government of the United States, including military and naval authority, therefore will recognize and maintain in freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to represent such persons of any, in any efforts that may make for their actual.
Okay, so time out. There's lots of whereofs and to wits and therefores. So what in the world is he saying? What does he say here, Molly?
He's saying that like what any slaves or like people African Americans and slaves, they're free.
Mm-hmm. Where?
And any state or
So any state or designated part of the state that's doing what? Look at the next line there. Rebelling. Okay? That's something you probably should highlight. Okay? So all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state. And then I skip down to be in rebellion against the United States. It's not talking about slaves rebelling. It's talking about the states who are rebelling. Did all slave states rebel? Which states did not? Do you remember?
Mississippi.
The other M. Missouri. Scoot over to the east. It's above Tennessee. Kentucky. Maryland. And the little one starts with a D. Delaware. Those are 4 slave states that did not rebel. So according to this document, are those slaves free?
No.
They are not. That's the major difference there. All right. So you need to remember that. And who does Lincoln say is going to protect their freedom? Military and naval authority. Yeah. So maybe highlight that. Military and naval authority will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons. Now, when will this occur? Yeah, January 1st. What year? 1863. But he proclaims this on September 22nd, 1862. Why doesn't he just free the slaves immediately?
Because he has to get the say so.
Well, if an executive order comes out, he doesn't really he doesn't have to get permission. Okay, so we're going to figure out why he waited until January 1st. Okay, let's see. That the next paragraph basically says the same thing. I don't know why, but there you go. So Ruth, if you want to continue to read, go down to where it says now, therefore, please. Down there at the bottom.
It's the last.
Yep.
Now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in terms of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. Do, on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and in accordance with my purpose, so to be publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days, from the day first above mentioned, order and designed as the state states. Northern. The Arkansas, Texas,
Read that last part up at the top there.
people therefore respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States performing.
Okay, so time out. So he says a couple things. He says who he is. Now, who is Abraham Lincoln? President and Commander-in-Chief and of what though? Army and Navy. So in this capacity, he's acting as a military leader. Okay. So why is he issuing this proclamation according to that paragraph? It's in there. As military commander, why is he issuing this proclamation?
Because it says in a time of armed rebellion against the authority and government, and that just means like there's a bunch of war going on.
And keep going. Yep.
Necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion.
Yes, I would highlight that. As a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. So why is he freeing the slaves?
He doesn't want like more wars and fights.
Right, so he's trying to end the war. Does that have anything to do with equality and justice?
No.
Not in this section here. Okay. So then he continues, and then we have this whole list of states here that are considered to be in rebellion. And look who's at the beginning. Arkansas. So this section lists all those states and parts of states that are rebelling, starting with Arkansas. And then it goes down to Texas, Louisiana, and then it has this huge amount of parentheses in here, except the parishes of da-da-da-da-da-da. Parishes are like counties in Louisiana. So at this point in time, I believe they had already captured Louisiana, New Orleans and the surrounding areas, and that's where they had already freed those slaves there. So those would not be in rebellion if it's Union controlled. And then it goes to Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except 48 counties. Those 48 counties become West Virginia. So they did not want to secede, and they actually were put back into the Union when they became West Virginia. So it actually lays out who is in rebellion at the time this has been said, September 22nd. Okay. All right, Ruth, you want to continue? Where it says, and by virtue of the power, second full paragraph there.
By virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and part of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the exclusive government of the United States, including the military, and naval authorities therefore will recognize and maintain the freedom of citizens.
All right. So again, he says it for a third time that those slaves in those areas are going to be free and that the government will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons. And then he speaks directly to those freed slaves. You want to continue, Ruth? Or do you want someone else to read?
And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed they labor faithfully for reasonable wages.
Okay. So what does he tell the freed slaves to do or not do?
Don't be violent unless like your life is threatened.
Yeah. So he's basically saying, don't seek revenge. Okay. So I would highlight that. Abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And what else does he say for them to do?
Labor faithfully
For wages. Yeah. I'd also highlight that. Labor faithfully for reasonable wages, whatever that means. You want to continue, Ruth?
And I further require to make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received in the armed service of the United States to bear some forts, positions, stations, and other places as command vessels of all sorts and such things.
All right, so what is this asking for? What is that portion asking for? He's still talking to the freed slaves.
if you can join the army.
Yeah, please join the Army or Navy. All right, and so if you underline or highlight that, it's that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. All right, and maybe possibly the most important paragraph, Ruth.
And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the
Constitution.
Constitution upon military
Necessity, yeah.
Can't English.
It's all good.
Necessity. I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
Okay. So
That
he
sounds kind of amusing.
so he adds other reasons why he's doing this. What are the other reasons? Besides military necessity.
Judgment of mankind and like favor of God.
Well, he's asking for kind judgment of the people and favor from God. That's what he's asking for. But before that, he says why he's doing it, besides military necessity.
Act of justice.
It's an act of justice. And the Constitution, he's saying the Constitution allows me to do that, by the way. So I would highlight to be an act of justice granted to me by the Constitution upon military necessity. So he actually gives 3 reasons why he's doing this. But what do you really think is the main reason? Military. It is. All right. Read the rest.
And witness therefore, I have
Hereunto. Yep.
set my hand and cause the seal of the United States to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, the first day of January, in the year our Lord 1863, and the independence of the United States of America of the 87th.
The end, right? So then he was like, I'm going to stamp the wax seal on there and make it official. So this is what the Emancipation looks like.
That was awesome.
It's almost like a work of art. Okay, that's tiny. Did you do this? I wonder if I bet it's still at the archives. Go see it. So it says by President Abraham Lincoln as well as Secretary of State William Seward. So he was one of the guys who was attacked and wounded. All right. So, and I think I skipped where it says that paragraph that said the same thing. It gives them 100 days to reconsider their rebellion. It says, if any shall then be in rebellion and in good faith come back and say, no, we're going to not be in rebellion, then I won't free your slaves. That's basically what it says. So what's he giving them? What's he giving the Confederate States? Yeah, like a second chance. So we won't free your slaves if you come back. But none of them did, right? That would have been interesting. So now let me ask the question again. If Mr. Lincoln passed the Proclamation, why would the 13th Amendment need to be passed as well?
For the rest of the slaves that didn't rebel.
Right. So for the slaves that were still in captivity in those border states that did not secede. And it's very clear what the 13th Amendment is abolishing there. So take a look at it real quick. It's kind of interesting. Think about this. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the U.S. or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So it says you can be enslaved or you can have involuntary servitude as a punishment. What do you think about that? Should that be allowed? To be forced to work without wages as a punishment for your crime?
Well,
Depends on the crime. Okay. Is that so? Do we do this today?
no.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we do. How so? Well, yes, community service. So what kind of crimes must you commit to garner community service? Murder?
No.
No. No. It's like small. Yeah. Maybe so. Yeah. So I remember when I was working at the Dr. Pepper Museum, we would get a lot of people for community service and we'd let them help make them clean, the grounds or whatever we could find for them to do. So, yeah. So we do kind of implement this as a punishment, but it does depend on the crime. So if it's a major one, that's not going to be the thing. All right. So look at section 2. A lot of people get hung up on section 2. What does it say? Anybody read that, please?
Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
All right. Well, what does that mean? Who's Congress? Who makes up Congress? Oh, we did this at the very beginning of school.
I remember what we did yesterday.
No, Congress is made up of people who represent the states. What is their purpose? What do they do?
They make the law.
Yes, they do. Thank you. So Congress has the power to enforce the 13th Amendment by appropriate what?
Legislation.
And what's another word for legislation? Lily? Laws.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in order to enforce the 13th Amendment, Congress can pass laws to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay. That's a considerable amount of power. And then it's the president's job to enforce those laws. Okay. All right. So the 13th Amendment is considered one of the first Reconstruction amendments to unify the United States after such a traumatic event in their history. So we may or may not talk about the others because we're going to run out of time for the school year. So tomorrow you're going to have an assignment that goes through the Emancipation Proclamation as well as the 13th Amendment. We've kind of already gone over that, so it shouldn't be too difficult for you to answer those questions. But I'll give you time in class to do that, or anything else that you may need to do as well. Okay? Didn't